Hello, hello. I'm Liz Booker, Literary Aviatrix. Welcome back to my Women in Aviation History textbook research and writing journey. All right, it's November. I started this project in August, so I wanted to check in and talk about where I am with the book, what topics I'm covering, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that I'm struggling with and some of the things that I feel like are going really well. First and foremost, I completed solid drafts of chapters 1 through 3. I sent those out to my advisors several weeks ago. I have responses from a couple of them on some suggested revisions, things to think about in my citations, maybe that aren't as strong as they should be. So that was really good to kind of get a pulse on how am I doing? Am I in the ballpark here? Like, am I hitting the right wave tops as I go through this? So just want to talk about what's in the first 3 chapters. So I currently have a really rough draft of what I'm calling chapter 0. And I don't think I'm going to be ready to really flesh that out fully until I'm done with the whole book. Because what that's going to do is that's going to kind of set up the arc of the women's and civil rights movements, and then the kind of the narrative arc of women in aviation against the backdrop of aviation history. And so I feel like I'm not going to know exactly what I need to say in that first sort of opening chapter until I've said everything I need to say in the rest of the book. So I'm holding that in reserve. Chapter 1 covers 1903 to 1918. I'm calling it The Birth of Flight and the Gendered Sky. We open obviously with Orville and Wilbur Wright and the first flight. And then what was their sister's role in that? Katharine Wright. So we talk about that a little bit. And we're kind of looking at the way that early aviation was gendered, the fact that aircraft manufacturers, especially in the United States, initially, Curtis and the Wrights refused to teach women. In France, they were being a little more inclusive. So we kind of talk about some of these first women: Raymonde de Roche, Harriet Quimby, Blanche, Stuart Scott. We talk a little bit about Lillian Todd and her aircraft design, and you'll hear more about that because I've interviewed an author about a book that she wrote about Todd. We talk about aviation clubs and the novelty of women pilots, World War I military aviation ramping up. And then we kind of talk about the history of aviation licensing and kind of how those records started to get created and the problems that that creates around trying to identify firsts. And the whole question of firsts is going to be an issue throughout this story because every first has qualifications to it, that, as we'll see. So moving on to chapter 2, that's covering 1918, so the end of the First World War, to 1932. And so back in chapter 1, we also talk about the suffrage movement that's going on. So that's sort of the time when women are fighting for their rights. We've got this post-Victorian era, and aviation is sort of representing like the like literal access and freedom that women are seeking to enjoy in earning their rights to vote, in earning property rights. So aviation kind of serves as this real opportunity for women to soar, but also sort of a metaphor for what women are seeking, the new woman who is emerging in this new century post-Victorian era. So in chapter 2, we're talking about 1918 to 1932. Here we've got a lot of technical improvements after the war in aircraft, so they're easier to operate. And now we're getting a lot of women in the aircraft. They're setting records. They are organizing with the 99s, the first Women Pilots Association. They have the first women's air race in 1929, the Air Derby. And the whole chapter kind of culminates in this symbol of Amelia Earhart flying her solo flight across the Atlantic. We talk about Amy Johnson in that chapter as well, and Louise Thaden, obviously, who we're going to see again in chapter 3, which covers the Depression era in 1932 to 1939, going up into World War II. And so this is where women are really proving themselves objectively. You know, they're setting altitude, airspeed, distance records. We have Louise Thaden winning the Bendix Trophy in 1936. We highlight Bessie Coleman in chapter 2, and then we bring her legacy into chapter 3 with the pioneering aviators in Chicago, including Willa Brown and Janet Harmon Bragg. We introduced Helen Ritchie, who we're going to see more of in the next chapters, who was famously the first woman technically hired by an airline and then kind of squeezed out. So in this chapter, we're really kind of seeing how while aviation is advancing and women are proving themselves, we're also seeing institutional barriers be developed to keep women out of formal opportunities to have careers as like in the airlines. They are banned from being pilots. We see Ellen Church go to Boeing hoping for an opportunity to fly as a pilot. They're not interested, but she does convince them to allow her to work in the cabin as cabin crew. She creates this opportunity for women to now take over what were originally men's jobs as cabin crew, as air stewards. She convinces Boeing that as a registered nurse, she's going to be able to, make the customers feel safe. So she recruits a few of her friends, and we have our first 8 female cabin crew working for Boeing. And that sets the stage for all kinds of shenanigans that are going to continue into the 50s, 60s, and 70s that we'll catch up with later. So that's where I am with chapters 1 through 3. I know they're going to need revision again later on once I get all that feedback from my advisors and I kind of see how the pacing is working throughout. But I'm feeling pretty good about the high points that I've hit in those chapters. I think there are things that, if you're even a novice student of the history of women in aviation, there are going to be a lot of themes and names and stories that you recognize there. But I also hope that I've kind of sprinkled in some things that are going to be new to most people. But again, operating within this format of, a textbook structure is really confining my word count, which is excellent because it makes me really think about what are the most important things and who are the people who can best illustrate these moments in our history. So now I'm working on chapters 4 and 5. When I ran through my first draft of what was just going to be chapter 4, and it was supposed to cover all of World War II, I just decided it was way too much information to cram into. There's just too much to talk about that was going on with women's participation in aviation at the time. So I went through the whole chapter structure and made some revisions later on that hopefully will work. And so now I have chapters 4 and 5 divided up to chapter 4 basically being like the global mobilization for World War II. So what was going on in Europe and how were we setting the stage? What were our women doing to support the effort before the United States joined the war? And then chapter 5 will be the women's participation after the United States has joined and what's going on there. So the thing that's challenging me the most right now is that I am learning feminist history while I'm writing this. And so I don't have as big or as rich a picture of all of the details. And and so like while I feel like I'm pretty confident, especially in this early part of our history of women in aviation, about what are the high points that need to be brought out. What are the things that I want students to take with them? What I'm less confident about are what were the things that were going on in women's and civil rights at any given time and how those either influence society's perceptions of women in aviation specifically or just women in general and how that might have shaped our opportunities and attitudes toward women serving in these aviation roles. So the good parts for me are I'm really in my groove when I'm talking about aviation events and things that the women were doing. I can feel like I can write that stuff. I know what the points are that I want to make. I know mostly where to find them because I have a new stack of books out for World War II that I'm working with. And I know kind of where to find the information. It's when I need to make generalizations about aviation itself. I mean, I have my Jepson and my Smithsonian aviation history books, but they're really kind of vague. And sometimes I want to get a detail and I have trouble like finding a good source for it. So beyond the actual writing of the textbook itself, I am continuing to explore what it is that I could possibly do with this later on. So I have had a conversation with a local university, a couple of conversations actually. One with a lady who is teaching the aviation history course in that university, and the other one who is a gender studies teacher. So, what I'm probably going to do just for my own familiarization is hopefully take the opportunity to sit on a couple of their classes, both their gender studies and their aviation course. And I'm going to work on putting together a case study for them to use in the classroom. And that'll just help me kind of get a feel for that kind of writing, kind of condensing my stuff down into case study work, and then hopefully be able to sit in on the class as they discuss it and kind of test these things out. So thinking longer term, I've done a little more research on adjunct professorships. There's a great YouTube episode that I will link in the show notes for somebody if you're going down this path and trying to figure out what you're going to do like I am. Um, there's a great video from somebody describing sort of what a an adjunct professorship would look like, and then what some other creative alternatives might be, like a visiting lecture or doing a visiting professor for a semester kind of thing. So these are kind of the things that I'm thinking about, not wanting to necessarily pursue a career in academia, but to get my foot in the door to be able to teach this material once I'm at a point in my life when that makes sense. So that's where I am with it. I'd love to hear your feedback. I want to thank everybody who has given me so much encouragement for this project. I really appreciate it. I still am super excited about it. I'm having so much fun doing this research. I'm a little scared about more recent history. So as we move on, like I feel pretty confident about these first 5 chapters. I feel like once I get into 1950s, things are a little squishy. Feel like the 70s, I feel like I have a really solid image of kind of what I need to hit in the 70s and 80s. And then as we keep moving forward and we get into more recent history, I think it's harder to pick out the highlights just off the top of my head. There are a few things obviously that are in your face, like Eileen Collins being the first shuttle commander, or women in combat, those kinds of things. But what else? And who are the right people to choose, to tell that story? I'm nervous about that as well. So we'll see how it goes. I'll keep trucking along. I thank you for your interest and support in this project, and I'll see you next time.